Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about liberalism in A-level politics. I'm going to start by looking at the development of liberalism over time, from the emergence of liberalism to classical liberalism to modern liberalism. I'm then going to look at the key agreements and principles within liberalism, as well as the key tensions and disagreements between the strands. And then finally, I'm going to look at the key thinkers and their ideas. The PDFs that you can see in this video, you can find on the Politics Explained website, in the first link in the description, where you can also find loads and loads of resources to help you in your Politics A-level, including updated textbooks, detailed essay plans, and a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. So leave any comments or questions in the comment section below, and without further ado, let's get into it. So this first part of the video is going to introduce the key strands of liberalism and look at its development over time. So starting with the emergence, then classical liberalism, looking at both early classical liberalism and the kind of development of classical liberalism in response to the Industrial Revolution. It's then going to look at modern liberalism, and then finally it's going to quickly touch on neoliberalism at the end, though you don't really need to bring that in as a strand, but just in case it confuses you, I'll kind of explain that a little bit. In terms of the key potential essay questions you can get asked, and this is in relation to the liberalism topic as a whole. The first key one you can get is to what extent do liberals agree, or you can get something like to what extent do modern and classical liberals agree. Luckily with liberalism, because there's only two strands, there's not kind of lots of variations of that question in the same way that there are for conservatism and socialism. Then crucially, you can get to what extent do they agree on the state, the economy, society, human nature. Of course, all of these could be phrased slightly differently, but if you know all of these plans, kind of these questions relatively well, you should be really prepared for the exam. And then finally, you got to what extent do they agree on some of these key principles of liberalism. So freedom or liberty, equality and social justice, individualism, democracy, and rationalism. And you'll note that with all of these questions, they're really focused on agreements versus disagreements. So to what extent is there unity within the ideology, or is that disunity far more important? And much later in the video, we're going to look at all of those in terms of the disagreements within the particular principles and the agreements between them, and looking at that debate, and then also look at state, economy, society, human nature specifically, and some overall kind of evaluation in relation to whether agreement or disagreement is more important. But that's getting ahead a little bit, so starting off, we're going to have a look at the emergence of liberalism. So liberalism crucially emerged in the 17th century as part of the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement in Europe based on belief in reason rather than faith, scientific inquiry, and the possibility for human progress. And this really challenged the kind of structure of politics as it had been before, which had previously been dominated by hierarchy and dominated by Christianity, in particular the idea of divine right, that the monarch had the right to rule due to their personal connection with God. And this kind of emergence of liberalism in Britain contributed to a kind of a really key event, which was the Glorious Revolution of 1688, where King James II was overthrown and replaced by William of Orange, who was Dutch, and Mary, his daughter. And this marked a significant shift away from divine right as deciding who's a leader, and also the kind of emergence of parliamentary democracy, and not democracy at this point, but the emergence of kind of constitutional monarchy and parliament growing as a force, growth of parliamentary power. And yeah, crucially, rather than focusing on Christianity, liberalism and the Enlightenment focus on the individual, which, as we'll kind of see throughout the video, is crucial to liberal ideas. And they believe that this individual had free will and could make progress for themselves and for society as a result. And crucially, it is also worth noting kind of liberalism also can be seen as having roots partly in the Reformation and the emergence of Protestantism, which is a version of Christianity that really emphasised this the individual, and would focus on the individual rather than Catholicism, which is more focused kind of on a hierarchy, which had been previously. So yeah, that's kind of crucial to the emergence of liberalism and its roots in the Enlightenment. What we're going to have a look at now is Locke and early classical liberalism, and Locke was really important to the kind of growth and emergence and first articulation of liberalism as an ideology. So it really started to take shape in the mid-17th century, influenced by the Enlightenment and its focus on individualism and progress, and Locke was really key. So his ideas really challenged this kind of pre-existing society, which I described, focus on divine right and hierarchy. and contributed to these kind of significant changes over the next couple of centuries. He argued that in the state of nature, so prior to a state, there were natural societies in which individuals enjoyed natural rights and freedoms. And in this context, this really shapes their view of the state, in which the state is presented as a threat to these freedoms and rights, and should therefore be limited to ensure freedom and individualism are maintained. So kind of real kind of emphasis, and you see this throughout liberalism, on the promotion of freedom and individualism as central to their ideology and their beliefs. So rather than being based on divine right, the state should be based on a social contract between the rulers and the ruled, with the latter having the right to remove those in power if they don't serve in their interests and they no longer consent to them being in power. Crucially, it is worth recognising, and we'll come into this when we look at some of the agreements and disagreements, that when Locke is talking about society and the social contract at this time, it's a very narrow view of what society was. So it excluded women, those who weren't white, and those who weren't wealthy. So it's effectively a small group of wealthy white men. So when he's talking about kind of freedom and individualism, that's really the kind of paradigm he's coming from. He's looking to promote effectively the freedom and individualism of people like himself, which kind of explains why some of his views, though he talks about government by consent, aren't as radical as like full democracy that you see coming later. Locke also, really important to his thought and kind of one of his other key texts, really focused on the promotion of religious tolerance, which is a very radical idea at the time, and this advocated for the separation of church and state and the freedom of individuals to practice their religion without government interference or coercion. Sorry, that should say practice there. So, and this led to the kind of foundational beliefs of liberalism, of classical liberalism, which were that individuals are rational and able to reason, which focused on promoting the freedom of individuals in order to allow them to pursue their goals and make progress. And as we kind of mentioned, the state is the key threat to this freedom, and as a result, there should be what's being described as a kind of night watchman state. So Locke didn't say this specifically, but it's a kind of type of state he advocated for, and it's called that because it should simply kind of adjudicate disputes when necessary, but otherwise just leave individuals free to pursue their lives. And in the economic sphere, and we'll look at this much later in the video, like in much more detail later in the video, Adam Smith was quite key in classical liberalism. So this is kind of key strand. This is the first strand we're looking at. It's described as classical liberalism in advocating for laissez-faire capitalism, so very minimal state intervention in the economy as well. And then also in this kind of early classical liberalism, you see Mary Wollstonecraft being a really key figure in effectively applying liberal principles. So she's very much a feminist, but kind of argued from a liberal perspective and argued that women are rational, women have reason, and therefore they should be afforded the same rights and freedoms that men are in society. And crucially argued that the treatment of women in society was against reason, and therefore argued for formal equality under the law. So women being granted the access to the vote, which they weren't at the time, and also same access to education as men were. And this is quickly having a look now at classical liberalism applied. So the American Revolution and state is a really useful way to understand how liberalism was applied to political practice. So you don't need to bring this in loads into the essay at all. You can bring it in maybe in one sentence in the essay if you think it's useful and it works well. It shouldn't be like the basis of your essay. But I think it's useful to understand that liberal ideas and classical liberal ideas were central to the American Revolution and in how the American state was designed. And yeah, crucially, liberal ideas influenced the Glorious Revolution, but it was really the American Revolution where they were really put into practice. So in terms of ideas that motivated the revolution, a lot of these key ideas were drawn from classical liberalism and from Locke. So ideas such as individual rights, representative government, and the rule of law, and that's why they really opposed the kind of British control in America. And the Declaration of Independence, if you read it, kind of really reflects this in its assertion of inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So there's a really liberal emphasis on individual freedom and self-determination. And then you see that in the design of the state. So the US Constitution, with its key system of checks and balances, separation of power, and the Bill of Rights, demonstrates this liberal commitment to limiting government power and protecting individual rights and liberties. And crucially, they were also driven by rejecting the arbitrary rule of the British and a desire for government based on the consent of the government, which were central tenets for liberal thought. And I suppose it also shows, in terms of what I was talking about earlier, in terms of when these classical liberals are writing, especially in these early classical liberals in this period, they're not writing for the whole of society. They're writing for a relatively small group of white men, and you very much see that. They're talking about the consent of the governed, but women don't have the vote, and of course, crucially, there's slavery for over 100 years after the American Revolution. So what we're going to have a quick look at now is then how classical liberalism developed in the late 18th and 19th century. And this is really important to understand because the 19th century brought big societal and political and economic changes that forced liberalism to evolve and to address new challenges and questions. So the Industrial Revolution dramatically transformed economies and societies, creating unprecedented levels of wealth, also kind of a lot of social and economic inequality and really growing inequality. And also in this area you saw the rise of the working class, urbanization, the expansion of capitalist economies, real expansion of colonialism, and this really kind of this change in the economy raised issues in relation to workers' rights, economic disparities, and the role of the government in regulating industry. And there's no kind of surprise that in this period you see socialism growing in support among certain sections of the working class. And also in this period you have the expansion of democratic ideals with the Chartist movement in Britain, which really brings into focus kind of the role of the state in kind of protecting everyone, ensuring welfare, and kind of the extent to which it is really based on the consent of the governed when the vast majority don't have the vote. And in some cases, and what we're going to have a quick look at now is how this led to a re-evaluation of classical liberal principles, looking at them again, and some really doubled down on them, as we'll see, in the face of these changes, whilst others argued that liberalism needs to change to adapt to its principles to a changing context. So first we're going to look at those who doubled down. And there's a couple of really useful or kind of key kind of ideas in relation to this, and they are social Darwinism and the concept of self-help. And Samuel Smiles and Herbert Spencer were important kind of extra thinkers you can bring in here, only when it's necessary in an essay. They're not the kind of key thinkers in any way, but just to illustrate the continued support for classical liberalism by some in this period. So first, Samuel Smiles on the concept of self-help. So he emphasised that personal responsibility and individual effort were the key to overcoming adversity and achieving success. So really, this kind of classical liberal emphasis on individuals should be left alone to pursue their own freedom and do what they want in what he saw as a meritocratic society. And he suggests that individuals could and should improve their individual social and economic conditions through hard work and perseverance, rather than relying on state intervention to support them. And similarly, Herbert Spencer applied the concept of social Darwinism to society, advocating the idea that, like in nature, only the fittest should survive in an economic context, which really, when you think about it, is quite a disturbing view. So promoting a laissez-faire approach, arguing that minimal state intervention allows for natural competition and societal evolution, and effectively those who weren't the strongest would just fall by the wayside, and he saw that as how it should happen, rather than the state should step in to help people and prevent them from kind of falling into poverty. And again, you see both of these thinkers were really writing from quite a privileged perspective, and you see that in their thought as well. So his views really justified limited state aid and regulation, and aligned with this kind of classical liberal emphasis on individual responsibility. In terms of these later classical liberals, you see other kind of thinkers and parts of thought who are kind of responding to it in a different way, rather than simply doubling down. And then kind of one of these key thinkers in the period who you may have heard of. I don't think you really need to bring this much into your essays. It's just useful because I think it comes up in quite a lot of the textbooks, and just to kind of effectively, I want to explain it so it's not confusing, is utilitarianism. And Jeremy Bentham was really key to this. And utilitarianism is really rooted in the liberal principles of freedom and rationalism, suggesting that individuals' actions are motivated by the pursuit of happiness and the avoidance of pain. So it's a very kind of mechanistic, which we'll look at more later in the video when we look at liberal views on human nature, a very mechanistic view of human nature, which effectively almost sees it like a machine, right? It's kind of in contrast to conservative views who see humans as quite motivated by emotions and imperfect. This is a lot more kind of mechanistic, rational view of human nature. So he and others believed that maximising the greatest happiness for the greatest number could be a liberal vision of how the state should act as well. So he believed that this was how effectively the individual acted and saw things. They sought to maximise their own pleasure and minimise their own pain, but he thought it could also be a vision for how the state should act. And this provided a rationale for democratic governance, as it argued that governments elected by and accountable to the majority were more likely to enact policies that benefited the greatest number of citizens. But again, his kind of promotion of utilitarianism, especially in terms of its use by the state, also raised concerns among some liberals who were really worried about its potential implications for minority rights. So if you have a real emphasis on the greatest happiness for the greatest number and effectively on majority welfare as a consequence, that could lead to the interests of individuals and minorities being overlooked and overridden, which really goes against some of these key classical liberals. And John Stuart Mill is one of these key figures in the period arguing against this idea. And he's a really key thinker who you're going to want to be bringing into a lot of your essays. And he kind of responds to industrialization in a bit of a different way. And this is developmental individualism and representative democracy. And as we'll look at when we look at Mill near the end of the video in terms of when looking at him as a thinker, he's quite complicated in that in some ways he really restates classical liberal principles. It could be seen as a classical liberal. But in other ways, he's definitely not a modern liberal yet, but he lays the groundworks for what will become modern liberalism and seeks to kind of develop and kind of evolve liberalism in the period and brings some kind of new ideas. So yeah, he expanded these key classical liberals and key classical liberal principles in many ways, and one of the key parts of his thought that you can see this in is the harm principle, which provided further justification for individual freedom and effectively argued that power, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized society against their will is to prevent harm to others. So if you're doing anything, whatever you want, as long as it's not harming others, there should be no intervention by anyone to stop you doing it, and particularly no intervention by the state. Mill was also quite important to articulating a growing or articulating a liberal support for representative democracy in the period, which kind of effectively developed Locke's idea of government by consent. And he saw representative democracy as a means to reconcile individual liberty with collective decision making. So as I mentioned earlier, he was quite skeptical or worried about the idea of democracy in some ways because it threatened individual rights. But he saw representative democracy as a way to kind of make sure it worked relatively effectively and individual rights were protected. So he supported broader democratic participation, but he was really worried about dangers of the tyranny of the majority. And he argued for a system of representation where elected officials were not just delegates of popular will. They didn't just do what the people wanted, as this would lead to tyranny of the majority and minority rights being disregarded. Instead, he thought they should be independent thinkers who could exercise their own judgment and represent a diversity of views, aiming to balance majority rule with the protection of minority rights. Another key one of his ideas, in which you can see the kind of development of classical liberal principles, is the idea of developmental individualism. So he believed that for individuals to be truly free, they needed not only rights and not only to be just left alone, but they needed the ability to exercise those rights and effectively use them, which kind of sees kind of development from the kind of egotistical individualism of classical liberalism. We're gonna look at all of these in a lot more detail later in the video. And for Mill, education was really key to this. So he saw it was really essential for helping individuals reach their potential and for the proper functioning of society and democracy. And he even suggested a plural voting system where those who were better educated had more votes than those who weren't. And as I kind of mentioned at the start, on the whole, he can be seen as kind of a transitional liberal, as in some senses he clearly continued to support key classical liberal principles and justify their continued implementation in changes to society, and the harm principle is the key element of that. But in other ways, especially his liberal justification for representative democracy, the kind of extent to which he developed the kind of classical liberal view of individualism in developmental individualism, he kind of developed classical liberalism significantly and paved the way for more radical modern liberal thought that came afterwards, even though he didn't necessarily completely articulate or agree with that himself. So yeah, what we're going to have a look at now is the key other strand of liberalism, and that's modern liberalism. And we're going to first look at early modern liberalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So as the economy and society continued to develop in this period, especially with continued development of capitalism, continued development of industrialization in Britain, modern liberal thought began to evolve, with other thinkers going further than Mill to argue that the state should take a more interventionist approach and actively work to mitigate the disparities and social injustices exacerbated by industrialization and free market capitalism. So Mill begins to talk about democracy, and he begins to talk about developmental individualism, so the kind of importance of the state providing education to help people evolve. But where modern liberals come in is they really believe in effectively using the state to help people be free within this kind of new context in which there's a lot of injustice, inequality in society. This was partly also driven by the political landscape in which there was now near universal manhood suffrage, and there was the emergence of socialist parties who created a new kind of working class electorate as well. So liberals did also recognise the need to appeal to these voters and balance these traditional liberal emphasis on individual rights with growing concerns about social welfare and economic equity. And in terms of these first key ideas, the first key thing you see is positive liberty. And this really contrasts with the negative liberty, and we're going to look at all of these in more detail as well later in the video, of classical liberalism. So negative liberty, effectively the classical liberal view on liberty or freedom, is the idea that effectively freedom is being left alone by the state to do what you want. Whereas what you see with thinkers like T.H. Green comes about and kind of challenges this. And effectively says that in the reality of an industrialized society under free market capitalism, individuals aren't wholly autonomous agents who can simply be left alone to be free. And he argued that true freedom, true liberty, should be understood as more than just the absence of restraint. It should be encompass the capacity to fulfill one's potential. So if you're just left alone but you can't fulfill your potential because you're discriminated against in society, or crucially, especially T.H. Green early articulated this idea, because you're poor in an unequal society, then you can't be free effectively. That's not true freedom. And he therefore believed that the state had a moral obligation to create the conditions that would enable individuals to realise their potential, therefore kind of achieving true freedom. And that included advocating for education, healthcare, social safety nets, and really setting the stage for the development of the welfare state. And you really see that in the early 20th century now with the Liberal government and the People's Budget, which was really important. And you see it also in this period, the emergence of Keynesianism. So in the early 20th century, modern liberalism began to manifest in political and economic policies. And really important, this was the People's Budget of 1908 by the Liberal government under Herbert Asquith and David Lloyd George in the United Kingdom. And this budget increased taxes on the wealthy to fund social welfare programs that address poverty and health issues among the working class. So obviously nowhere near to the kind of extent to which socialists supported it, but it was already supporting those who were disadvantaged in society to enable them to be free. So this included pensions for the elderly, unemployment and sickness insurance, and significant investments in education and healthcare. And it was really a radical move that laid these foundations for the modern welfare state, and really actualised and implemented modern liberal ideas of social justice and supporting those who are disadvantaged. And the economic theory of Keynes is really important kind of develops in the 1920s and 30s and becomes really important to modern liberalism as well. So he really challenged this classical liberal belief in laissez-faire capitalism. So he argued that free market capitalist economies are prone to cycles of boom and bust, leading to periods of mass employment and economic instability, which obviously, again, this idea that prevented people from their true freedom and individualism. And he therefore advocated for active state intervention in managing economies, suggesting that government should regulate interest rates and increase public spending during economic downturns to stimulate demand and mitigate the effect of recessions. And this gained really significant traction, in particular in the US, with the FDR's response to the Great Depression, with the New Deal, which was kind of included large-scale government spending, programs on public work programs, financial reforms, and social security, which embodied these Keynesian principles. And that's kind of really saw a big shift in the role of the state in economic affairs. And then what we see in the mid to late 20th century is the kind of real full articulation of modern liberalism. So you see it beginning to develop in this period, but with in particular the thinkers of John Rawls and Betty Friedan what you see is its real articulation in this period and the real shift away from classical liberalism. And in this period, it developed to include constitutional reform, to enhance democratic governance, social liberalism, to address kind of the issues of civil rights and social equality, and the practical application of these ideas in the establishment of the welfare state in the UK. So Rawls was really key, arguably the most important thinker in relation to modern liberalism, and he provided a detailed justification and defence of it in A Theory of Justice. And he effectively developed the concept and liberal justification for what he called, actually I don't know if he actually specifically called it himself, but what we can kind of refer to as an enabling state that used progressive taxation and substantial public spending to establish a robust safety net. And the idea of this is it enables people to be free. It gives them the kind of support needed to pursue their own freedom, pursue their goals, progress, etc. So this was designed to facilitate true positive freedom for all individuals, ensuring not just negative freedom, not just the absence of restraint, but also the capacity to utilise your freedom effectively. And you see also he kind of really built on Keynesianism, and his support for Keynesian economic thought was clear in his advocacy for the state intervention in managing economic cycles and promoting general welfare. This is a real move away from the classical liberal view of a limited state intervention and laissez-faire capitalism, to recognising that the state should play a role in preventing the inequalities created by capitalism, because they influence people's freedom, and the state should play a role in managing capitalism. And in his defence of this modern liberal approach, because he was accused by some of being a socialist, he said it's not a surrender to socialism. Instead, he argued that redistributing some wealth within a capitalist framework and creating a society where the poor and disadvantaged are supported was both rational and consistent with liberal values. So for all, such a society enables all individuals to be free, regardless of their economic status, rather than just the wealthy and the rich, which, as we looked at earlier, kind of classical liberals are mainly writing for that specific group. And he justified this stance through his veil of ignorance thought experiment that asks individuals to design a society without any knowledge of their own position with it. And he theorised that under this kind of, he called this kind of the original position, and under this veil of ignorance, it's rational. And this is the kind of real emphasis again on human rationality and reason, which is why this is a liberal justification for it. It's rational for individuals, that individuals would want to create a society that safeguards the least well off, ensuring a fair distribution of resources and opportunities. And this would lead to a just society where freedom and equality are not just promised, but actually actively realised for everyone. In terms of the application of modern liberal principles, I think we can really see this in the post-war period in the United Kingdom. And central to this is the Beveridge Report, which really laid the foundation for the modern welfare state. So it was published during World War II in 1942 and outlined a comprehensive social insurance system designed to address the major social evils of want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, and believed it should be implemented after the war. And it gained a lot of traction, particularly on the front lines as well, and was kind of implemented due to kind of that democracy afterwards as a result. And it was implemented after World War II with the establishment of the NHS, the expansion of the welfare state through various social security measures that ensured this safety net for the unemployed, elderly, and other vulnerable groups. So you see this shift in practice towards a more interventionist enabling state rather than a night watchman state that would try to enable all of its citizens to truly exercise their rights and have true positive freedom. You also see the implementation of progressive taxation in this period and Keynesian economic management being implemented to try and implement some level of redistribution to help to support this kind of greater state role, but also to help those lower down in society. And also you see in Keynes the management of free market capitalism rather than simply leaving it alone. So this period was not just about recovery from the devastation of war. It was a kind of really important reimagining of the role of the state in society, a departure from this classical liberal minimal state. Instead, kind of, as I kind of mentioned, a vision where the state actively ensures the welfare and rights of all its citizens. Also really important in this period is Betty Friedan, and this is where you see kind of social liberalism as being really important to modern liberalism. So it emerged as a crucial component of modern liberalism in the second half of the 20th century, giving strong support to campaigns for greater racial and sexual equality. And this emphasised not just formal equality, which Mary Wollstonecraft, who can see kind of as a classical liberal, emphasised, but also the need for active measures to address deep-rooted societal prejudices and structural inequalities. So you see a similar support for a greater role of the state in this regard, rather than just economically. And Betty Friedan was really important in articulating the challenges faced by women in her groundbreaking work, The Feminine Mystique, where she explained how women were restrained not only by a lack of formal equality, but also by pervasive social attitudes that undermined their rationality and autonomy. So these prejudices were perpetuated through cultural norms and practices which denied women true freedom and potential for self-realization that liberalism believed, or kind of, I suppose, claimed to believe, was innate to all humans. So therefore, she called kind of emphasizing these, or kind of embodying these social and modern liberal principles, called for state intervention to dismantle these barriers. So the enactment of laws to prohibit discrimination on gender, as well as support for affirmative action to ensure that women not only had equal rights on paper, but also genuine equality of opportunity to succeed. So you see similar in this kind of shift from negative liberty to positive liberty. It's almost a shift to positive liberty, saying, yeah, we advocate for freedom, but we actually want to advocate for true freedom for everyone. It's not just leaving people alone, which kind of works for those who are rich and wealthy and male in society. We actually need true freedom, and this is what true freedom is, and you do need state intervention to pursue that. And the exact same here. It's not just about kind of formal equality. You need true state intervention to redress inequalities in order to pursue this true equal opportunity. So her arguments extended the discussion of rights and individualism, that's the key to kind of liberalism and classical liberalism, to include the impact of societal factors on an individual's ability to exercise their freedoms fully. And by promoting state action to correct these imbalances, she and other social liberals sought to protect and enhance individuals' natural rights and individualism, recognising that true freedom and equality are achievable only in a society that actively works to eliminate legal and societal forms of discrimination. And a final key part of modern liberalism that you see in the period is an emphasis on constitutional reform. So this became a key focus of modern liberals in the 20th century, kind of further building on the kind of Mill's idea of representative democracy, and they kind of really wholeheartedly support democracy in this period. Not direct democracy, crucially, because they still kind of have this fear of, one liberals in particular have this fear of tyranny of the majority, but especially representative democracy. So they believe that kind of changes should be made to create a more democratic and accountable system that was kind of therefore essential to uphold these key liberal values of individualism, liberalism, representation, and fairness in a modern context. So you see this in their advocacy for electoral reform in the UK, to have a more proportional electoral system that was more democratic and fair. You also see advocacy for removing the House of Lords, which obviously is a key kind of undemocratic part of the UK political system, as well as a focus on better protecting individual rights in the UK. The final quick thing I want to have a look at, and there's a reason it's quick, even though they're called liberalism and they can be seen as a liberal strand, then is neoliberalism. Crucially, not considered part of the liberalism part of the course by the edX exam board, so you don't need to mention them, and don't get yourself confused. Use neoliberalism as part of the new right in the conservatism and your conservatism answers. It's much better to just not bring them in to your liberalism answers. In a way, they're very, very consistent with classical liberalism anyway, so just bring in classical liberalism instead. And it's the key debate, or key kind of debate over agreement or disagreement is between classical and modern liberals in this edX course. But neoliberalism emerges in the late 20th century, and it's partly as a response to this modern liberalism, and it's effectively, as I said, kind of an advocacy for a return to classical liberal principles, including support for minimal state intervention, negative freedom, and laissez-faire capitalism. But yeah, it's kind of despite this agreement with classical liberalism, the exam board really considers it part of conservatism, because it kind of came up on the right, effectively, with Thatcher and Reagan as part of the new right when combined with neoconservatism. So I thought I'd just explain it quickly, but say, don't bring it into your essays. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now is the real key part of the video. And we're going to look at the key principles and agreements of liberalism. So looking at individualism, freedom and liberty, state, rationalism, equality, social justice, and liberal democracy. These ones mentioned in the spec, as well as some others that I'm going to bring in to make sure we kind of cover all of the content. And within these when we look at these key principles and agreements, we're also then going to look at the key disagreements and tensions between the strands in relation to these particular principles. Obviously, in some principles, there's going to be more tension compared to others. So in this key bulk, this middle of the video, the key part, this is going to be all the content, the real detail you need for the explanation in the exam. So yeah, starting off, we're going to have a look at individualism. So individualism is a key principle of liberal thought, and it emphasises that the needs and rights of each individual person, are more important than those of any group. And that links into what I was talking about at the start. This focus on the individual is central to liberalism. So it's not merely a preference for individual over group needs, but a really deep philosophical stance that every person has inherent value and the right to self-determination, and that promoting groups or other individuals over each individual is wrong, as it goes against these rights and goes against these fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. So they fundamentally believe that society and politics should therefore be structured to promote the autonomy and freedom and well-being of each individual, rather than primarily serving the interests of groups, whether defined by class, religion, or any other collective identity, which you see in a lot of other political ideologies. So, empowering individuals is also seen as the most effective route to progress and justice in society. So they have the belief that when individuals are free to pursue their own paths, society as a whole benefits. And with its natural laws and rights, along with the inherent rational nature of humans, they believe that society naturally promotes individualism, and therefore it's the state that can threaten this individualism that is inherent to society. So crucially, individual, the primary unit of analysis in society. So this shapes liberal views on society, the state, economy, and human nature. What you have in classical and modern liberalism is slightly different interpretations of this individualism. So this is where you can bring in disagreement paragraphs. In particular, though, you can argue that there isn't much disagreement as well. So the individualism that classical liberals support can be seen as egoistical or egotistical individualism, a concept closely tied to the idea of negative liberty and a minimal state, both of which we'll look at in more detail later in the video. So this viewpoint believes that the best way to achieve a better society is simply by letting individuals follow their own interests with little government interference. It argues that people naturally are self-interested and follow their own interests and happiness. And thinkers like Locke are key proponents of this view. They argue that when people are left to pursue their self-interest, guided by rational thinking, it ultimately benefits everyone in society. So rationalism ensures that the pursuit of one's interest doesn't harm others and lead to significant conflict. So they don't see this egoistical individualism and this promotion of this egoistical individualism in society as threatening major societal conflict, as they believe it won't lead to conflict. It won't lead to one's interests harming others. Instead, it would lead to a rational consensus and agreement between individuals. So classical liberals argue that individuals are the best judge of their own interests and what they do, as it not only fosters personal responsibility and independence, but this also respecting this individualism and promoting this egoistical individualism also stimulates economic development, innovation, and societal progress. So as a result, this leads to influences their policies on the state. They champion policies that reduce government control over economic and personal life, advocating for free markets, property rights, and limited government intervention, as this creates an environment where individual initiative and enterprise can thrive. Modern liberalism comes in with a slightly different view. So they argue for developmental individualism, which is really rooted in the thought of John Stuart Mill. And this is the argument that each person should have the chance to develop their talents and abilities to the fullest. And it really links into positive liberty and argues that true individual freedom doesn't just involve the absence of constraints, but also requires providing individuals with the tools and capabilities to pursue their ambitions and goals. So modern liberal thinkers emphasise that for individuals to truly flourish and contribute to society, they need access to certain resources and opportunities, including education, healthcare, and social welfare programs. Egoistical individualism doesn't emphasise this classical liberal view. Instead, they see humans as innately, as they are, possible to pursue their own goals. They don't need this help from the state, and therefore you just allow everyone to pursue their self-interest. So it shifts the focus from simply protecting individual rights to actively creating conditions that enable all members of society to realise their potential, suggesting that personal growth and societal progress are interdependent, When individuals are supported in their development, society as a whole becomes more prosperous and harmonious. So they kind of have this shared view that actually if you respect individualism, it leads to societal prosperity. I suppose the developmental individualism and modern liberalism suggests that you can't just leave individuals alone to do this. They sometimes they need help in order to kind of truly kind of pursue their kind of self-interest and kind of give them the real capability to do so. And this, again, as with classical liberals, influences their view on the state. So they advocate for a more involved government that not only ensures basic rights and freedoms, but also takes active measures to level the playing field. Okay, so the key next kind of principle and agreement we're going to have a look at, and this is really central to liberalism, is freedom or liberty. And it's a key central concept in liberalism, holding that individuals should be left alone to think, speak, and act and make decisions based on their own interest and judgment, including their own view of human nature. So every individual should have the autonomy to live their life as they choose without undue interference from the state or other societal groups. So this links into individualism, as they argued that for freedom, not just to protect people from coercion or constraint, but to create an environment where people can actively pursue their goals. So the freedom of the individual is paramount above the interests of any group. It shows that link to individualism as well. But crucially, freedom must be under the law. This ensures that while individuals should be free to pursue their own interests, this freedom is balanced by legal frameworks and societal norms that ensure their actions don't harm others and that the rights of all individuals are protected. So the rule of law is really crucial in this context, as it provides a kind of boundaries within which individual freedom can flourish. I thought we'd quickly have a look at the key ways in which liberals guarantee or promote individual freedom. So they advocate for constitutional rights that protect freedom, such as freedom of the rights of expression, assembly, and religion. And these should be kind of enshrined in laws and constitutions as they are in the American state in the Bill of Rights. It also extends to advocating for a pluralistic society, so a society in which diverse viewpoints, cultures and lifestyles are not only tolerated but celebrated as expressions of individual freedom. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail when we look at tolerance as a key principle. So they argued that a diverse society enriches the collective experience and allows this kind of full exercise of individual liberties. And this really extends to defending minority rights as well, which kind of ensures that all individuals enjoy equal freedom and protection from under the law. Crucially, another way they seek to guarantee and promote freedom is through their support for democracy, for liberal democracy. So participation in free and fair elections, the right to run for office. They believe that this kind of democratic political system is not just a form of government, but a means of kind of realising and protecting individual freedom. And agencies serve their real opposition to arbitrary government that isn't based on consent. And then crucially, they also promote economic freedom, and that's really underlies their emphasis on capitalism. Crucially, however, what we're going to have a look at is the key difference in the type of freedom and liberty that liberals support. And this is a really key kind of the underlying their views and then explaining in your essays their different views. So, for example, when you're explaining their view of the state, you'll bring in classical liberals' view of negative liberty, which influences how they see it. And then vice versa, modern liberals' different view of the state is influenced by their different view of liberty. So classical liberals, as we've kind of mentioned in this video, advocate for negative freedom. So this sees freedom as the absence of restraint or interference, and sees individuals as free if they're not prevented from exercising their free will and judgment by an external force. So promoting freedom as a result is therefore about the removal of barriers and limitations imposed by the state or other authorities. So if the state's not interfering with you, then you're free, and you can pursue your own interests and make your own decisions. So Locke and Adam Smith argue that the best way to ensure individual freedom is through a limited government and laissez-faire economic system where the market's effectively left alone. So by minimising the role of the state in economic and personal affairs, it seeks to protect individuals from undue coercion and control, ensuring that they're free to kind of choose their own paths in life. And you see, and we can look at this earlier in the video, we'll also look at it later on when we look at John Stuart Mill specifically. He supported this minimal state intervention with the harm principle, which argues that individuals should be free to act as they wish unless their actions cause harm to others. And therefore that really supports a vision of the state that shouldn't interfere in people's lives. Modern liberals, by contrast, argue for positive freedom, which argues that the mere absence of restraint, so negative liberty, just leaving people alone, isn't enough to promote true freedom. Instead, individuals need to have the conditions and the capabilities necessary to be autonomous and realise their potential. And this is crucially important for those who start from disadvantaged positions in society, such as those who are poor and discriminated against. Modern liberals argue that without the support from an enabling state, these individuals don't have the same level of freedom as those who are not in disadvantaged positions. And this really shows, I think, how modern liberals are effectively writing for the whole of society, whereas classical liberals are effectively writing for a small group of white men, right? So, of privileged white men. So when Locke's talking about individual freedom, and he's seeing it in terms of negative freedom, because effectively he himself, he's a property owner, he's relatively rich, he's relatively wealthy. If there is undue interference from the state, of course his freedom will be capitalized, but otherwise he sees himself as being able to be free and sees people like him as being able to be free. As a result, freedom is just the absence of this coercion, the absence of this constraint. Whereas those who are in disadvantaged position in society, okay, so even if there's not interference from the state, they're not free because they can't truly exercise their freedom, can't truly exercise their individualism and pursue their goals to the same extent as those who are advantaged in society can. So modern liberals, as a result, believe that the state should play a crucial role in creating an environment where individuals can develop their talents and achieve their goals. And this advocates for this involves advocating for an enabling state and policies like universal education, healthcare, and welfare programs. So by providing this support, the state enhances individual freedom rather than threatening it, enabling people to be self-determining and actively participating in shaping their own lives. So modern liberals definitely agree that the state can go against freedom, right? They definitely agree that the state, and they believe in freedom and liberty, and they believe that the state can threaten freedom, but they also believe that the state can play a key role if the right state and the right policies play a key role and needs to play a key role in promoting freedom for all. Simply leaving people alone isn't enough. So I hope that's kind of explained what I was saying at the start in terms of how these kind of different views of freedom, negative versus positive freedom, also lead to their different views on the economy and the state. The next key principle we're going to have a look at, and this is really crucial to their views on human nature, is rationalism. So this key principle of liberalism asserts that humans are rational creatures capable of reason and logic. There's a very optimistic view of human nature. So it underpins the liberal view that individuals equipped with rationality are the best place to determine their own interests and make effective decisions. They're able to work out what is best for themselves through reason, and this will also benefit society as a whole as a result. So a very positive view of human nature. And this leads them to supporting a society, economy, and state that focuses on promoting individual autonomy and trusts individuals to make their own decisions. So classical liberals argue that rational self-interest alone will promote economic prosperity and social harmony, and that individuals should simply be left alone in a free market economy with limited state intervention to make their own choices. Modern liberals, by contrast, like we've kind of had a look at, argue that individuals should be supported so that they have the capabilities to exercise their rationality effectively, but they fundamentally agree that individuals are rational, and they agree with the rationalism. So they acknowledge that individuals can make rational decisions, but also recognise that societal conditions, education, and access to information can significantly impact an individual's ability to reason effectively and be able to exercise their reason crucially. So Rawls and Friedan argue that to make truly rational decisions, individuals need a certain level of support from the state, or to kind of exercise their rationality in a way that will benefit them, I think would be a better way to kind of explain it. Individuals need a certain level of support from the state, such as access to education and protection from socioeconomic disadvantages. And really important in articulating this support for rationalism is Wollstonecraft, who crucially argues that this rationalism and belief in that humans are reasonable, have reason, can exercise their reason, should be extended to women as well. So she challenged the prevailing societal beliefs of her time when she was writing in the 18th century, which depicted women as inherently inferior to men in intellect and agency, and argued that women are inherently rational beings, fully capable of reason and deserving of the same educational opportunities as men. So she asserted that any perceived inferiority of women was not the result of natural differences, which many argued in the period, but due to inadequate and unequal education, which stifled their intellectual development and confined them to subordinate roles in society. So she advocated for a change in the way that society views women and educates women, emphasising that with proper education they can make decisions independently and contribute equally to society. So the kind of belief in rationalism should be extended to women, which it wasn't in the period by a lot of classical liberals as well. So she wrote in The Vindication of the Rights of Women, "Let woman share the rights and she will emulate the virtues of man. She must grow more perfect when emancipated." So she needs to be given this ability effectively to be free to exercise this rationality. Another key belief in human nature that we can have a look at, and this also of course links into society, is the belief in progress and a very optimistic view of human nature. So this optimism is grounded in the idea that people who have reason and agency, so they are rational, can determine their own futures and actively participate in shaping societal progress. So classical liberals hold that society functions as a meritocracy, where individuals can rise based on their abilities and efforts regardless of their initial social standing. And you see this in later classical liberals with like the thought of Samuel Smiles and the concept of self-help, which argues that individuals have the power and responsibility to improve their own circumstances through hard work and perseverance, even in the context of an industrialized society. So liberals believe that when individuals are free to pursue their talents and ambitions, not only do they progress personally, so it's not just about individual progress, but they also contribute to the collective advancement of society. And this links into this kind of real belief in individualism and egoistical individualism in particular. The advancement of knowledge, technology, and societal norms, and this is also very much linked to this kind of Enlightenment ideas, are seen both as a product and a testament to this individual and collective progress. So modern liberals agree that society should promote a meritocracy, but challenge classical liberal views that this is the case under laissez-faire capitalism without the support of an enabling state to help those who are disadvantaged. They very much do still believe in this progress, this optimistic view of human nature, but they also believe that actually leaving people alone isn't enough. And that's where you see the kind of beliefs in the state, and this links into their view of positive freedom and developmental individualism rather than negative freedom, minimal state intervention, and egoistical individualism that classical liberals support. The next key idea we're going to have a look at is capitalism and private property. So capitalism is strongly supported by liberals, reflecting their belief that economic freedom is integral to individual liberty. So it links into their kind of key principles of individualism and liberty. It's not just an economic system for them, it's a manifestation of individual rights and freedoms based on the principles of private property, free markets, and voluntary exchanges, which liberals argue are essential for personal freedom and societal progress as well. So they argue that when people are free to trade, which is in the capitalist system, compete and pursue their economic interests, it leads to the efficient allocation of resources, innovation, and overall progress, which benefits society as a whole. It also promotes a meritocracy and therefore equality of opportunity in society. And capitalism, crucially, also promotes private property, which for liberals is seen as a natural right in society and a crucial component of individual freedom. So this is the idea that individuals should be able to have private property because they should be able to reap the benefits of their own work. And it also is seen as giving individuals a stake in society, which makes it inherently opposed to kind of arbitrary rule, therefore kind of promoting liberal views of kind of freedom and democracy within society. And you see this in influencing the takings clause of in the Fifth Amendment of the US Constitution, of the Bill of Rights, stating that private property should not be taken for public use without just compensation. What you do see, however, is quite an important difference between classical and modern liberals in the type of capitalism they support. And as I've kind of explained previously, this really links in to their different views of freedom and their different views of individualism. So classical liberals support laissez-faire capitalism. So it's a very free market type of capitalism where there is minimal government intervention, so little regulation, low government spending, low taxation. And it aligns with the classical liberal view of negative liberty, positing or kind of arguing that freedom in economic pursuits is best achieved in an environment with few governmental constraints or interferences. So in a laissez-faire system, classical liberals believe that individuals are free to engage in economic transactions as they see fit, allowing supply, demand, and price setting to occur naturally without external interference. So Adam Smith is in particular really important to this. So he's often referred to as the father as modern economics, and he argued that the invisible hand of the market leads not only to freedom but also to the most efficient and beneficial outcomes for society as a whole. So classical liberals believe that this laissez-faire capitalism allows individuals and society as a whole to build wealth, and that this wealth created by individuals will naturally trickle down to everyone and benefit all of society. And importantly, meritocracy was also important, as they saw laissez-faire capitalism and laissez-faire economy as a meritocratic system, where success and advancement are based on individual talent, effort, and achievement. And the government should therefore play very little role in economic affairs. Instead, it should focus on maintaining law and order, protecting property and individual rights, so that people can act in the economy with confidence. There's a kind of less of a real major focus on law and order like the Conservatives, but a real kind of promotion that actually a justice system is necessary, and that the key role of the state is to protect property and individual rights. Modern liberals have quite a different kind of interpretation or a version of capitalism they support. So they believe in Keynesianism and an enabling state. So they don't believe in laissez-faire capitalism. In fact, their overall ideas can be seen as stemming in large part as a critique of laissez-faire capitalism's ability to truly promote freedom and individualism for all. Instead, they begin in the 20th century to argue for a Keynesian economic approach and an enabling state in economic affairs within the capitalist system. So Keynesianism, rooted in the thought of John Maynard Keynes, emerged as a response to the limitations of free market laissez-faire capitalism, particularly during economic downturns such as the Great Depression in the 1920s. It argued that active government intervention is necessary to stabilise economies, especially in times of recession. So he argued that during economic downturns, consumer spending increases, leading to reduced business activity and higher unemployment. And to counteract this, the state should intervene through public spending, reducing taxes, and lowering interest rates so that more money is spent in the economy to stimulate demand and effectively pull it out of recession. You see this with FDR's New Deal in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression, where you have a lot of big public spending on public works in particular. And this really sharply contrasts with the classical liberal stance, which advocates for minimal government intervention and letting the market pull itself out of recession. And alongside a Keynesian approach to tackle these booms and busts of capitalism, modern liberals argue for an enabling state in economic affairs to promote freedom and individualism for all. In particular, for those who are disadvantaged due to the inequalities produced by free market, by laissez-faire capitalism. The enabling state shouldn't try to control the economy. It's not socialism, but it should try to help empower all citizens in society to pursue their freedom and individualism. So it crucially should provide play an active role where the market fails. So that's through implementing policies such as progressive taxation to have some redistribution to help those who are disadvantaged in society, social welfare programs, and public services that aim to kind of level the playing field and promote freedom and individualism for all members of society. As we looked at kind of earlier in the video, this is promoted in particular with the Beveridge report, and which kind of really laid the groundwork for the British welfare state, where you have this kind of welfare state, including the NHS, which kind of promotes, seeks to provide a safety net that promotes freedom for all in society. So Rawls in particular argued that ensuring fair access to resources and opportunities allows individuals to fully realise their potential and contribute more effectively to the economy. And he justified the redistribution of wealth through progressive taxation by arguing that it's rational to do so, as people would naturally want to see inequality reduced and the poor being given sufficient support. And he effectively argued to disagree with this laissez-faire kind of classical liberal view that the economy is a meritocracy under capitalism. It's not. You actually need state intervention in order to kind of, in his view, create this meritocracy and enable everyone to pursue their goals and be free. And the enabling state also kind of promotes it aims to promote a fair market by regulating industries and preventing monopolies and protecting consumers. And you see that in Theodore Roosevelt, comes before FDR, where he kind of the antitrust laws, which really broke up the key monopolies in the American economy at the time. In terms of private property, modern liberals really continue to support it. It seems that they agree that it's a vital component of personal autonomy and a condition for individual liberty. So they align with this kind of classical, traditional liberal view. But they do believe that the unfettered accumulation of property can lead to social and economic inequalities that undermine fair value of political liberties and equal opportunity. Therefore, while kind of Rawls and modern liberals support the right to private property, they also advocate for this kind of system of redistributive taxation and social welfare policies to ensure that the inequalities arising from national distribution of talents and circumstances don't lead to unjust advantages for just a few. So they believe in private property and that you should be able to have private property, but they don't believe in completely leaving the economy alone and just allowing the growth of inequality. So to such an extent, obviously they believe in some inequality, right? They're not socialists who want to pursue complete kind of absolute equality, but Rawls to believe that this progressive taxation is a useful method to kind of have some extent of redistribution in order to help those who are more disadvantaged in society. Okay, so the next key kind of liberal principle and liberal idea we're going to have a look at is the idea that the state is necessary yet evil. So we're going to have a look at their key kind of ideas on the state specifically. So liberals view the state as necessary to prevent disorder and chaos, but they are also deeply worried about its evil potential to infringe on individual liberties. And as a consequence, they argue that its power and its powers should be limited. So the idea that the state should be limited is a core kind of tenet of liberal thought, as they're deeply worried about the potential of an arbitrary, non-democratic state and government to threaten rights and freedoms of individuals. And this links in with their economic views, as they argue that a too powerful state can stifle economic freedom and innovation by imposing excessive regulation, taxes, and controls. As a result, they believe that the role of the state in the economy is to create a kind of favourable environment for business and individuals to thrive, rather than controlling or directing economic activities, as socialists argue. So they have a fundamental fear that this kind of expansive arbitrary state can encroach upon individual freedom, and believe that freedom is inherent to society. And this links into their view of kind of natural rights and natural society, which we'll look at in a bit. It's kind of this idea that in a natural society, individuals have these rights and freedoms, and a state is effectively kind of artificially created, including by government consent. So therefore, in relation to this natural society, the state is a threat. The state is a threat to individual liberty. And kind of as a result of this, when they're supporting a state, they argue that it should be limited and there should be measures to protect against an arbitrary state, including checks and balances within government, a clear separation of powers, and protection of civil liberties in the Constitution. So that's where you see the US state as a key kind of manifestation of these liberal principles. And this crucially, as I was talking about, they have a real belief in a mechanistic theory of the state. So this is the idea that the state has been created by the people to directly serve their interests like a machine. And by giving the state clear roles and limits, they can ensure that it operates effectively and doesn't interfere with the individual liberty. So they see the state as really designed by humans effectively. So they do see the state as necessary to prevent disorder and adjudicate disputes between individuals by providing law and order. In the state, it is natural that there would be disputes between individuals following their interests, and this needs an adjudicator to resolve. A truly liberal state should therefore be the arbitrator of social justice and the protector of individual liberties, preventing the infringement of rights of one individual by others. And therefore, the state should create an environment where individuals can safely exercise their rights and freedoms with confidence. Crucially, however, as I kind of referenced before a few times in this video, classical and modern liberals have a very different view of the size of the state and how the state should be. So classical liberals crucially support a limited night watchman state, which guards us against external threats and internal disturbances when necessary, but interferes as little as possible in the personal and economic affairs of its citizens. This aligned with the kind of classical liberal principle of negative liberty, and emphasises that the primary function of government should be to protect individuals' rights, and that the most effective way to do this a lot of the time is just simply leave people alone unless it's necessary to do so. And this is kind of rooted in the belief that excessive government intervention in the lives of individuals not only infringes on their freedoms, but can also lead to kind of inefficiencies and stifle economic growth. So in a night watchman state, the government's responsibilities are largely confined to providing some services that can't be provided by the market, including national defence, justice, and enforcing contracts, protecting private property, and some public infrastructure. Modern liberals, by contrast, support an enabling state. So this is belief influenced by the concept of positive freedom and developmental individualism. And it argues that to truly promote freedom for all, the state needs to step in at points and empower those who are disadvantaged rather than simply leaving people alone. So we've already looked at this a little bit when we looked at their economic views. So they recognise that in a capitalist system, some individuals will be left behind and disadvantaged, including those who are poor and discriminated against. And as a result, they don't have the means and opportunities to truly exercise their freedom and individualism. And as a result, the state should play a proactive role in addressing the inequalities created by the market and supporting those who are disadvantaged. So Rawls in particular argued that ensuring fair access to resources and opportunities allows individuals to fully realise their potential and contribute more effectively to the economy. This involves the state stepping in to provide education, healthcare, social security, and other necessary resources that enable people to overcome barriers and achieve their potential. To do so, they raise money through progressive taxation, recognising the inequalities created by capitalism. So the state doesn't just protect the disadvantaged, but actively empowers them to be free and participate fully in society. So it's really about this promotion of individualism and freedom. So both classical and modern liberals believe that the view of the state is driven by individualism and freedom. But classical liberals believe that the best way to do that is to leave people alone. Modern liberals believe that actually the state should take an interventionist role to do so, particularly for those who are disadvantaged in society. As we already covered, you see this in the kind of welfare state, the groundworks of which were kind of laid by the Veterans Report. And social liberalism in the 20th century we're going to look at in much more detail when we look at, now at equality and social justice, also strongly supports state action to tackle inequality and discrimination, including through affirmative action. So the next kind of key principle of liberalism is equality or social justice. And their core principles of liberalism stemming from the belief that all individuals, irrespective of their background, are of equal value and deserve to be treated with impartiality and fairness by society. This is rooted in a kind of liberal commitment to individualism, which posits that every individual person has intrinsic worth and should be given equal opportunity to exercise their autonomy and reason and reach their potential. So that's linked to this kind of view of rationality as well. So liberals argue for foundation equality, which emphasises that everyone has intrinsic worth and should have access to basic rights and freedoms, irrespective of their background. And also formal equality, which ensures that laws and policies are applied uniformly to all individuals. So in terms of the classical liberal view of equality, they really emphasise formal equality and meritocracy. So they predominantly support this concept of formal equality, which advocates for equal treatment of all individuals under the law. So it emphasises that laws and rights should be applied uniformly without bias or favouritism towards any particular group. So for classical liberals, this is fundamental to ensuring that every individual has the freedom to pursue their own goals and potential. And Mary Wollstonecraft is really key in setting out this classical liberal view and arguing that, making the case for formal equality and equal rights under the law for women, arguing that the liberal principles of individual rights and freedoms should not be confined just to men. So her advocacy extended beyond just education, so she argued that women should have access to education, but she also called for equal rights under the law, including voting rights, property rights, and equal opportunities in employment. And she wrote in a vindication of the rights of women ought to have representatives. Instead of being arbitrarily government without any direct share, allowed them in the deliberations of government. So by kind of not having this formal equality, you're also going against the liberal principle of democracy and of individualism and freedom. She argued that the treatment of women was against reason and that they should be treated as rational individuals and given the freedom and rights and education to develop their individual potential just as men were. Not only would this enable women to be free and therefore fulfill the principles of liberalism, it would also benefit society and the economy as a whole. So it links into their belief in progress and optimism as well. So classical liberals generally view society as a meritocracy, where individuals, regardless of their birth or social status, have the opportunity to succeed based on their talents and efforts. They really believe that there is kind of an equality of opportunity in society. So their version of social justice, because they view society as this meritocracy, is therefore about removing interference by the state, which could threaten this inherent meritocracy that they believe is the case. Modern liberals disagree. So they continue to support classical liberals' support for formal equality, but they went further, arguing that society isn't a meritocracy and that state action is needed to promote true equality of opportunity for all, tackling structural disadvantages and societal attitudes. The modern liberals argued that society isn't inherently a meritocracy and that certain groups face structural disadvantage that impede their ability to compete with others on an equal footing, to be equal. They argued that promoting true equality of opportunity requires more than just legal and formal equality. It necessitates kind of active measures by the state to level the playing field. So Friedan, in The Feminine Mystique, challenged oppressive laws and societal norms that limited women's roles. So she continued Wollstonecraft's kind of fight for women's rights and formal equality, for example, by advocating for the Equal Rights Amendment in the US. Crucially, however, she went further than Wollstonecraft in arguing that societal attitudes and cultural norms play a key role in perpetuating inequality, whilst also arguing that the state should play an active role in levelling the playing field through measures such as affirmative action and laws to tackle discrimination. So modern and social liberalism, kind of socialism as part of modern liberalism, go beyond the classical liberal view of just simply in removing state-imposed barriers to success. Actually, the state should actively create the conditions for equality, and to create these conditions where individuals, regardless of their background, have genuine opportunities to achieve their potential. So it's not a meritocracy, just leaving it alone. You actually need to create that meritocracy and create that equality of opportunity. So this kind of recognise that real equality requires both the removal of legal barriers, but also the implementation of positive measures to address entrenched social and economic disparities. And you see that through affirmative action in terms of and quotas to kind of really redress inequalities and promote equality, which Friedan is a strong advocate for. Okay, almost finishing going through these principles now. The next one we're going to have a quick look at, there's not really major disagreements with this, is natural rights and society. So the idea of natural rights and a natural society. And these are foundational principles of liberal thought, specifically kind of really articulated by Locke. And they argue that people have inalienable rights simply because of their humanity, and that in a pre-political condition, prior to the state, they have rights to life, liberty, and property. And as I kind of mentioned earlier, this is really key to influencing liberals' fundamental fear of an arbitrary, tyrannical state, as they believe that prior to the state, which is mechanistic, it's created like a machine by humans. So prior to that state, in a natural society, individuals have these rights and have these freedoms. Therefore, the state can only be a threat to that and should be really limited and carefully controlled and made a liberal state in order that rights aren't threatened. So Locke was really instrumental in articulating this view, arguing that in the state of nature, individuals are free and equal, and that the formation of government should be aimed at kind of maintaining and preserving these natural rights rather than infringing upon them. And this continued in modern liberals as well. So John Rawls, in The Theory of Justice, also focused on the protection of individual liberties, advocating for a societal structure that upholds basic rights and freedoms whilst addressing inequalities. So he continues to believe in this kind of protection of natural rights, but within a just and equitable societal framework. Tolerance is another key kind of a principle of liberalism, and this is rooted in the belief that a just society must accommodate and protect various beliefs, lifestyles, and identities as long as they don't harm others. So this is closely linked to individualism, recognizing that protecting minority rights and allowing diverse perspectives to coexist are essential to individual freedom and societal progress. And John Stuart Mill's harm principle kind of encapsulates this idea that the individuals should be able to do what they want, act as they wish, provided they're not harming others. So this is kind of the importance of balancing individual liberty with social responsibility. And he wrote in On Liberty, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. And he also strongly supported tolerance of diverse viewpoints, arguing that individuals, no matter how certain they may be of their beliefs, can still be wrong. And therefore, all individuals should be able to freely express themselves and hold different views as long as they don't harm others. And I think there's a really good quote which kind of demonstrates his view, where he says, if all mankind minus one were of one opinion, mankind will be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind. And that really links into individualism and the belief that the society should be focused on protecting the individual rather than promoting any group rights. And that also influences, as we spoke about before, his real fear of tyranny of the majority in democracy. So early classical liberals, in particular Locke and also Mill, championed religious freedom, which is really kind of a key issue at the time. And this promotion of religious freedom by Locke was actually a really radical view at the time, where religious conformity was often enforced by the state. So Locke argued the state shouldn't impose these religious beliefs. And in the 20th century, modern liberals continue to uphold these principles. And you see this in the advocacy to encompass broader social liberalism, including supporting civil rights movements, anti-discrimination laws, to kind of promote and protect the rights of all in society. Okay, I think this is the final principle we're going to have a look at now. It is, yeah, and that's liberal democracy. So this is a belief that government should be based on the will of the people through elections, but that the state should be limited, should also be limited to ensure that it protects rather than infringes on civil liberties. So that's kind of this combination is a kind of liberal view of democracy. So they're supportive of democracy, but also wary of its potential to harm individual rights, especially through tyranny of the majority. So the emergence of liberalism in the 17th century was in large part about opposition to divine right and arbitrary government. And instead they support government by consent, ensuring that it's served in the interests and freedoms, the interests of individuals, and protect their freedoms and individualism. And I think that kind of, maybe Locke doesn't articulate this yet in his government consent, but elections ensure that people can have a say and promote this kind of government consent, gives them the ability to vote out governments that don't serve their interests. Importantly, however, they're also concerned about the possibility of democracy and its possibility to threaten the rights and freedom of individuals through tyranny of the majority. And this reflects their principle of individualism, that the needs and rights of each person are more important than those of any group, and as a result, they support kind of a limited state, and a very liberal state kind of embodies this with kind of checks and balances, separation of powers, independent judiciary that you see in the American state. Where we can see a bit of a difference between classical and modern liberals is the extent to which they support full democracy. So Locke kind of really started this liberal belief and really argued for consent, government based on consent of the government. So his social contract theory suggested that individuals form societies and governments through an implicit agreement to ensure the protection of their natural rights, such as life, liberty, and property. And this theory asserts that the legitimacy of a government stems from the consent of the government, and its authority is conditional on their ability to safeguard these rights of the government effectively. Very radical view at the time, moving away from divine right and laying the groundwork for democracy. But crucially, this concept of government by consent didn't mean he supported kind of universal democracy or universal suffrage as we understand today. Instead, it was more narrow about the consent of property owners. And this reflected the fact that when he was talking about rights and society at the time, he and others were only really referring to a small group of privileged, white and wealthy men. And you see that actually in kind of almost all Enlightenment thought of the period, almost all Enlightenment thinkers, maybe a bit later the ones who spoke of like rights and liberty, individualism, and then supported colonialism and supported slavery. So their views, do you know what I mean? Their views shouldn't be seen as like massively radical and completely advocating for freedom and individualism for all in society. It's for who they saw the society was at the time. And you see this in Mill as well. So despite supporting representative democracy and the extension of the vote to women, John Stuart Mill was cautious about the impact of democracy, fearing direct democracy and arguing that representatives should be able to exercise significant judgment themselves. Modern liberals, by contrast, especially in the 20th century, advocate for full democracy. So they do support kind of limited government, and they don't advocate for kind of referendums and direct democracy. But they do believe in the kind of extension of voting rights to all segments of the population, universal suffrage, as a means to ensure that every individual's voice is heard and represented in the democratic process. And they also see this in their championing of constitutional reform, aimed at improving the functioning of democracy. So often including measures to improve transparency, accountability, and fairness in the electoral system. So in the UK, you see that as kind of in a promotion of proportional representation, as opposed to first past the post. Cool. So that was pretty much going through all of the kind of key principles and the agreements and disagreements within each. What I'm going to have a look at now is effectively looking at the state, society, economy, and human nature, and summarising these key ones we've gone through in the agreements and disagreements for each, and then this should really help you in effectively planning your essays. So in terms of the state, key agreements and principles are the idea that the state should promote individualism and freedom, the idea it's necessary, yet has the potential to be evil and therefore should be limited. Also, they should treat individuals equally under the law, promote tolerance and protect the rights of minorities, and they should be based on liberal democracy and include a decentralisation of power. Key tensions and disagreements are the kind of classical liberals' support for a night watchman state versus modern liberals' enabling state. Modern liberals' support for greater state intervention in the economy compared to classical liberals supporting a kind of a very limited state intervention in the economy. And you see the same in terms of state intervention to achieve equality and social justice. And then you also see that though they both support government by consent, classical liberals' view is much less radical. They don't support full democracy in the same way that modern liberals do. In terms of the economy, key agreements are support for capitalism and private property as it promotes individualism and freedom. And that's where, in these kind of essays on the economy, society, when speaking about these other principles, linking them back to the key other principles of liberalism is really important, especially individualism and freedom, because they're the really key ones. There's agreement that inequality holds women back in the economy, in particular between Wollstonecraft and Friedan. Key tensions and disagreements are laissez-faire capitalism that classical liberals support versus a Keynesianism and enabling state of modern liberals. And these, of course, as I spoke about, I think a lot of times influenced by their different views of freedom and individualism. And classical liberals believe that capitalism creates a meritocracy when left alone, and modern liberals don't. In terms of society, key agreements are that it should promote individualism, freedom and progress. There are natural rights and a natural society, which the state is kind of presented as a threat to. Society should promote tolerance and protect the rights of minorities, and also promote equality and social justice. Classical liberals believe, so these are the tensions and disagreements now, is that classical liberals believe in negative freedom compared to modern liberals believing in positive freedom. Classical liberals believe in egoistical individualism, versus modern liberals believing in developmental individualism, though I'll argue that those differences, like the difference between egoistical and developmental individualism, isn't as great as the difference between negative and positive liberty. Classical liberals support formal equality and see society as a meritocracy, whereas modern liberals don't see society as a meritocracy and argue that there should be, go further to argue that the state should kind of act to create equality of opportunity. And many classical liberal views are written for a society of the privileged, wealthy white men, whereas modern liberals' views are kind of applied more broadly to everyone in society. In terms of human nature, agreements are support for rationalism and individualism, an optimistic view of human nature and belief in the possibility of progress, the belief that people have natural rights, and support for equality across the population. Disagreements you can see in egoistical individualism versus developmental individualism. And classical liberals believe in negative freedom and argue that people can just be left alone in a meritocracy, whereas modern liberals actually believe that people need support, human nature needs support in order to guarantee positive freedom. So then the final thing we're going to have a look at before going on to the thinkers is some of these kind of, I'm just given two examples of overall evaluations. So one that agreement is more important than disagreement, and one for the other side, which should give you an idea of how you can make these. They're very much one of the most difficult things to do in the A-level. It should give you an example of how you can make these kind of A-star level arguments and some of the things you can bring into your evaluation. So the interpretation there is more agreement than disagreement among liberalism is that both modern and classical liberals are clearly driven by supporting key principles of liberalism, by supporting principles of freedom and individualism in particular, which are fundamental to understanding all of their beliefs on human nature, the state, society, and the economy. And both strands have a great focus on promoting individual autonomy, which unites them and differentiates them from other ideologies such as socialism and most strands of conservatism. Though they are clear, there are clear differences between modern and classical liberals in a number of areas. It can be argued that these differences reflect a development of classical liberal ideas to a different modern context of industrialization. Though this results in some different beliefs and outcomes, particularly in relation to the state, these beliefs share and are driven by the same fundamental principles and agreements of freedom, individualism, capitalism, rationalism, optimism, progress, democracy, equality, tolerance, and the free state, and therefore there's more agreement than disagreement. On the other hand, it can be argued that there's more disagreement than agreement. Though modern liberalism may have developed from classical liberalism, it's far more interventionist as a strand than classical liberals and leads to very different beliefs in what the state should do. And it can be argued that classical liberals would be strongly opposed to many modern liberal policy positions, as kind of neoliberals are, and argue that they're in fact threatening the principles of individualism and freedom rather than promoting them. And this can be seen in this kind of development of neoliberalism in the 20th century, partly in response to modern liberalism. And this is influenced by the fact that their interpretations of key principles of liberalism are fundamentally different. So positive freedom is a very different and more radical idea than negative freedom. Keynesian economics with an enabling state leads to a much more interventionist state than classical liberals, who believe in laissez-faire capitalism and a night watchman state. And classical liberals would really oppose these kind of modern liberal views. Equality of opportunity and really promoting it is a more transformative intervention than formal equality and simply preventing societies of meritocracy as it is. Full democracy is far more radical than government by consent, and development in total individualism leads to very different state policies compared to egoistical individualism. And these can therefore be seen as major differences in ideology and policy positions that reflect the fact that classical liberalism is a set of beliefs designed to protect the wealth, property rights, and freedom of a small number of privileged white men, with everyone else excluded from their idea of society. Whilst radical ideas at the time, certainly, especially Locke, writing earlier, this set of beliefs is very different to those of modern liberals, who support significant change and an ideological vision for everyone in society, particularly those who are disadvantaged. And therefore, it can be argued that they're very different ideologies, and they're more different than they are similar, even though they're writing in different contexts. Okay, so in this final part of the video, we're going to look at the liberal thinkers, including those in the Specification and their ideas, so Locke, Wollstonecraft, Mill, Rawls, and Friedan, but also some I've mentioned throughout the video from outside the Specification that you can use and can really good to kind of push your mark up to the A star and bring extra analysis at times that you definitely don't necessarily need to use them even to get an A star. So yeah, we'll start with the thinkers named in the Specification, and a lot of these kind of key ideas we've already looked at throughout the video. It's just kind of restating them and showing how they're specific to each thinker. So first one is John Locke. Strand, classical liberalism, importance is very important, should be mentioned in every essay. And so he's an English philosopher and physician, and is seen as kind of the founder of liberal thought. During the late 17th century, his theories emerged in support of Enlightenment ideas of liberty, government by consent, and natural rights of individuals, and in doing so he established the principles of liberalism, strongly supporting the freedom of individuals and limited government, and his key work was two treatises of government, where a lot of the some of the quotes we're going to use, or you could use, are from. Key ideas, so the first one is natural rights and social contract theory. So Locke argued that in the state of nature, there were natural societies in which individuals enjoyed natural rights and freedoms, and in this context he presented the state as a threat to these freedoms and rights, and suggested it should be limited to ensure freedom and individualism. So rather than being based on divine right, as states previously were when he was writing, the state should be based on the consent of the government. And his social contract theory suggested that individuals form societies and governments through an implicit agreement to ensure the protection of their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And therefore the legitimacy of the government is based on this consent of the government, and it's conditional on its ability to safeguard these rights effectively. And if those in power don't do so, they have broken the contract, and the people have the right to remove them from power. So this is real start of the advocacy for government by consent. So this was an extremely radical view at the time, moving away from divine right and laying the groundwork for democracy. But Locke's concept of consent didn't equate to universal suffrage or democracy as we understand it today. It was more about the consent of property owners rather than broad-based democratic participation, reflecting the fact that when he was writing, when he spoke of society, he was effectively writing for a small group of privileged white men. Crucially, and it's very much linked to his belief in government by consent, he supported limited government. So his belief in government by consent and protecting the freedom of individuals led to this support, and he argued that the scope of government should be restricted to the powers willingly entrusted to it by the people, and the functions of government should be confined to the administration of laws, enforcing contracts, and protection of rights of individuals against external and internal threats. So limited, not much state intervention in the economy in order to prevent it kind of threatening individual freedom. So he wrote in Second Treatise of Government, the power of the legislature being derived from the people by a positive voluntary grant and institution, so that's that social contract, can be no other than what the positive grant conveyed. So they can't go beyond what the people consent to. And anything more, this kind of limited role of government threatened rights and freedoms of individuals. And crucially, he also emphasised the importance of separation of powers to prevent any single entity from accumulating too much control, which could lead to tyranny. And you see that kind of these ideas being implemented in the American state. Okay, next key thinker is Mary Wollstonecraft, also a classical liberal, And she's very much still important, particularly in relation to equality and human nature. Locke, you're probably going to be bringing into every essay. Wollstonecraft, I think you should be trying to bring to almost every essay, but there'll be some things where, like her ideas, like bringing in Locke might be a bit better way to articulate the point than bringing in Wollstonecraft, or give an example. And then crucially, I mentioned this in the conservatism video as well. When you're using these thinkers, they should be your paragraph should be strand driven, not thinker driven. Crucially, so you should almost think of these thinkers as examples. So explain what the strand is saying and what they think, and then bring in a thinker-specific example. For example, Wollstonecraft said this. So she was a key figure in feminist thought in the 18th century, and her writings emerged as key to advocating for women's rights and equality, aligning with the liberal ideas of reason, equality, individualism, and arguing that women were equally rational to the same fundamental rights of men, especially in her key text of Vindication of the Rights of Women. So first key idea was the idea that women are rational and independent beings capable of reason. So she challenged the prevailing societal beliefs of the time, which depicted women as inherently inferior to men, and argued that women are inherently rational beings, capable of reason and deserving the same educational opportunities as men. She asserted that any perceived inferiority of women was not the result of natural differences, but of inadequate and unequal education, which stifled their intellectual development and confined them to subordinate roles in society. And she advocated for a change in the way society views and educates women, emphasising that with proper education and formal equality, we'll look at formal equality, but women can make decisions independently and contribute equally to society. So she wrote in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, let women share the rights and share the rights, and she will emulate the virtues of man. She must grow more perfect when emancipated. So there's a fundamental belief that women are equally rational and should be treated as such by society. She also made the case for formal equality under the law and equal rights for women, arguing that liberal principles of individual rights and freedoms should not be confined just to men. So she went beyond education, advocating for voting rights, property rights, and equal opportunities in employment. She argued that the treatment of women was against reason, and that they should be treated as rational individuals and given the same freedom as rights and education to develop their individual potential, just as men were. Not only would this enable women to be free and therefore fulfill the principles of liberalism, it would also benefit society and the economy as a whole, as their individual pursuit of progress would benefit the whole of society. So linking into that kind of idea of egoistical individualism. Next key thinker is John Stuart Mill. If you had to describe him as one strand, some of his views are pretty consistent with classical liberalism, and you can use things like the harm principle to support a classical liberal point. But he could also, I'd say, it's more likely better to be considered as transitional liberal, kind of in between classical and modern liberalism, as though he definitely wasn't a modern liberal. Some of his ideas kind of developed classical liberalism and almost laid the groundworks for modern liberalism when it came later on. Very important and can be brought into most essays in the same as Wollstonecraft. So he was a British philosopher and economist in the 19th century, and his writing championed individual liberty, freedom of expression, and pursuit of personal autonomy in a context of significant industrialisation and social change. In works in particular on liberty, he argued passionately for the rights of individuals regardless of gender and social status, advocated for the expansion of suffrage, the promotion of education, and the removal of barriers that hindered personal development. First key idea is the harm principle. So this kind of really built upon and extended the key classical liberal principle of kind of freedom, negative freedom and individualism. And effectively it argued that the only purpose for which power can be rightly exercised over any member of a civilized community against their will is to prevent harm to others. So if you're not preventing harm for others, there's no kind of legitimate way in which a state can interfere with you. And I kind of reinforced this kind of classical liberal emphasis on personal autonomy and the limits of state intervention. He also strongly supported tolerance of diverse viewpoints, arguing that individuals, no matter how certain they are, can still be wrong, and they should therefore be able to freely express themselves and hold different views as long as they didn't harm others. In the context he was writing, he importantly applied this to religious views, and imposed coercive measures against religious minorities which stifled individual liberty and hindered societal progress. Another key kind of his ideas was representative democracy and developmental individualism. So as calls for universal suffrage grew when he was writing, particularly with the Chartist movement, he updated Locke's notion of government by consent by advocating for representative democracy. seeing it as a means to reconcile individual liberty with collective decision-making. And while supportive of broader democratic participation, Mill was also deeply worried about the dangers of tyranny of the majority. So he argued for a system of representative democracy where elected officials weren't mere delegates, so kind of implementing popular will, but were able to exercise their own judgment in a way that kind of balanced majority rule with protecting minority rights. And he also advocated the key concept of developmental individualism, that believed that for individuals to truly be free, they needed not only rights and being left alone, but also the ability to effectively use those rights. He saw education and ensuring that people had education as key to this idea, even suggesting a plural voting system where more educated individuals would have more votes, reflecting his belief in an educated electorate, that an educated electorate was crucial to informed decision-making in a democratic society. John Rawls, like Locke, very, very important thinker and should be mentioned in every essay, central to the articulation of modern liberalism. His landmark work was A Theory of Justice, which presented a new approach to understanding and a new justification for justice and fairness, and a real liberal justification for it. First key idea is a theory of justice and an enabling state. So he provided a detailed justification and defense of modern liberalism in A Theory of Justice, arguing that modern liberalism and an enabling state were key to achieving justice and fairness in the 20th century. He developed the concept and liberal justification for kind of a more greater state intervention that used progressive taxation and substantial public spending to ensure a robust safety net in society. And this was designed to facilitate true positive freedom for all individuals, ensuring not just negative freedom from interference, but also the capacity to utilise one's freedom effectively. He justified this in A Theory of Justice, writing, "It may be expedient, but it is not just that some have less in order that others may prosper." Therefore, kind of promoting the idea that actually there's a liberal justification for tackling inequality. So he emphasised that this modern liberal approach was not just surrender to socialism in its belief in greater state intervention. He instead argued that redistributing wealth within a capitalist framework and creating a society where the poor and disadvantaged are supported was both rational and consistent with liberal values. And key to this was his veil of ignorance thought experiment, which asked individuals to design a society without any knowledge of their own position with it, so kind of from what he called the original position. And he theorized that under this veil of ignorance, it was rational, and that rational individuals would create a society that safeguards the least well off, ensuring a fair distribution of resources and opportunities. And as a result, he sought to demonstrate that an enabling state and the pursuit of positive liberty was not only fair, but entirely consistent with a liberal emphasis on rationality. Betty Friedan is a final named thinker, again a really important thinker of modern liberalism who can be brought into most essays. Like Wollstonecraft, she was a key feminist activist and emerged as a key thinker and a key figure in the second wave feminist movement of the 20th century. Her groundbreaking work, along with a lot of her writing in magazines, a kind of feminist mystique, ignited a kind of revolution in feminist thought and advocacy, and it challenged the prevailing notion of women's fulfillment solely through domestic roles and motherhood, sparking a national conversation about gender roles and women's rights. She articulated the frustrations and aspirations of millions of women who yearned for greater opportunities and freedom beyond the kind of confines of the box they were put in by society of traditional gender roles, and called for greater women's participation in the public sphere, advocating for equal rights, education, and employment opportunities. In terms of our key ideas, first key one was legal equality. So she challenged oppressive laws and societal norms that limited women's roles, continuing Wollstonecraft's fight for women's rights. This can be seen in her advocacy for the Equal Rights Amendment in the US, which was aimed at guaranteeing equal rights for all American citizens regardless of sex. And she was also successful in campaigning for the passage of the Equal Pay Act of 1963. She was also really important in the National Organization for Women, an influential group in the women's rights movement that focusing on advocating for legal and societal changes to achieve gender equality. Crucial also was her belief in true equal opportunity. She explained that how women were restrained not only by a lack of formal equality, as Wollstonecraft pointed out, but also by pervasive social attitudes that undermine their rationality and autonomy. She argued that these societal attitudes promoted the view that the primary role of the women of women was that of the wife and mother, and that this confined them to the domestic sphere rather than being able to kind of truly pursue their individualism, their goals and careers. And she called these attitudes feminine mystique, which suggested that women could find complete fulfillment and identity exclusively through domestic life. She highlighted how these prejudices were perpetuated through cultural norms and practices, effectively denying women the true freedom and potential for self-realization that liberalism believed was innate to all humans. She wrote, "We need to see men and women as equal partners. It's hard to think of movies that treat women as full human beings," showing the emphasis and the influence of these kind of cultural norms. She embodied the principle of social liberalism, calling for state intervention to dismantle these barriers, with the enactment of laws to prohibit discrimination based on gender, and also affirmative action to ensure that women not only had equal rights on paper, but also genuine equal opportunity to succeed in society. So she therefore recognised that formal equality, and just legal equality, isn't enough. True equal opportunity was necessary for women to be free, and the state played an important role in pursuing that. We're going to have a look at now with some extra thinkers that you can bring in to kind of illustrate points in particular essays. And probably maybe the most important one of these is Adam Smith. He's very much a classical liberal and should definitely be brought in when writing about classical liberal views of the economy. Generally seen as kind of the father of modern economics, and really articulated the principles of free market capitalism or laissez-faire capitalism. So his advocacy for laissez-faire capitalism was deeply rooted in his belief that individual freedom in economic pursuits leads to the most efficient allocation of resources and the greatest increase in national wealth. He argued that economic prosperity and social societal well-being are better achieved through minimal state intervention in the market, in the economy, and through individuals pursuing their own self-interest. So maybe this is kind of an egoistical individualism view. They'd naturally act in ways that would allocate resources effectively and therefore contribute to societal progress. And he called this phenomenon the invisible hand of the market. And as a result, argued that government intervention should be limited as it would interfere with this effective allocation of resources. So arguing that the state should take a hands-off approach in economic matters, intervening only to maintain law and order and protect property rights and provide certain public goods when the market could not efficiently supply them. A couple of things we're going to have a look at now are key classical liberals who effectively doubled down on classical liberal principles in the context of industrialisation. So this is Samuel Smiles and then Herbert Spencer. Both of them aren't really necessary to bring in, but can be useful to kind of illustrate certain points. So Samuel Smiles' key idea was self-help, which argued that individuals could and should take personal responsibility for improving their own lives through hard work and perseverance. He argued that in the context of kind of economic transformations and also inequalities brought about by industrialization, personal initiative was key to kind of capitalizing on these opportunities. And he kind of really venerated the idea of like a self-made individual as an ideal product of the era, and it was kind of a reaction against growing calls for state intervention to support people. And this kind of concept resonated with the liberal idea of meritocracy, suggesting that regardless of one's social class or circumstances, success was always accessible through self-improvement and effort. Herbert Spencer, again, it can be seen as restating these classical liberal views in the context of industrialization with his concept of social Darwinism, which advocated the idea that, like in nature, only the fittest should survive in an economic context. So he promoted a laissez-faire approach, arguing that minimal government intervention allows for natural competition and societal evolution, leading to stronger economies and overall progress. So he was effectively justifying the view that in an industrialized society, yes, there's growing inequality, but that's simply the weak falling by the wayside, and the government shouldn't stop. Effectively, that will eventually lead to a more effective society where the strong survive, which, when you think about it, is a really dodgy view. So his views justified and limited state aid and regulation, despite the context of increasing inequality and poverty in an industrialized society, and this aligned with the classical liberal view and emphasis on individual responsibility. Finally, we're going to have a look at a couple of thinkers, modern liberal thinkers you can add. First is T.H. Green, who isn't necessary, but is useful to bring in when talking about positive liberty, as he was kind of, though he didn't use the term positive liberty, was kind of key as to its early articulation in the late 19th century. So he articulated a vision of liberty that diverged from classical liberals' notion of negative liberty, which saw freedom simply as the absence of external kind of constraint or interference. And for Green, true liberty meant the capacity of individuals to realise their own true nature and potential through personal development and moral self-determination. And this was only achievable within a social framework where institutions and conditions support rather than constrain personal growth. So he argued that the state has a key role in fostering an environment where educational and social resources are made available to all, thus enabling individuals to achieve their full potential. So it's about creating the conditions necessary, and this is a kind of really underlines and starts this belief in positive liberty that we see really emphasised by later modern liberal thinkers who kind of really argue for an enabling state as a result. And yeah, he starts this kind of arguing for a proactive role of the state in enhancing and promoting individual liberty. And then the final thinker we're going to bring in is Keynes, modern liberal thinker who's very, like Smith is for classical liberalism, is very useful in bring in and writing about modern liberal views of the economy, and is a very key economic thinker in general. So he advocated for what would be known as Keynesian economics in response to the shortcomings of the free market and the shortcomings of laissez-faire capitalism, particularly during periods of economic downturns such as the Great Depression. And he argued that during times of economic crisis, private sector demand could be insufficient to maintain full employment, and it was necessary for the government to step in and stimulate demand through public spending and lowering interest rates. And therefore, by injecting money into the economy at the right time, demand would increase, therefore spurring production and employment. So therefore, state intervention is crucial to times of economic downturns, but he thought it was also really important to stabilise the economy in the long run. You see, this is kind of the shift, modern liberal shift away from laissez-faire economics and a hands-off approach in economic affairs to recognising that the state has an important role to play. Cool, so that's pretty much everything for this video. I hope that you found it useful. As I kind of mentioned at the start of the video, all of these notes in this video you can purchase on the Politics Explained website, along with the conservatism and socialism notes as part of the core ideologies textbook. And also on the website, there's lots of essay plans, other updated textbooks to help you in your politics A level, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in, if you want that kind of one-on-one support with your A level. But yeah, thank you very much. Let me know if you've got any questions or comments in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next video.